But we're on the Promised Land, Lesson 9, the British Mandate. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. When I started this series, we started this series because of what's going on over in Israel and Gaza, what's taking place there, because there was the talk of the Jews said, this is our land that's here, and the Palestinians says, it's our land here. And so they're arguing about whose land it is, and that was part of what created the problem that we ran into, is they've been having that dispute for centuries over that particular plot of land. That little spot of land that is smaller than, we have several states that are bigger than the nation of Israel. So anyway, with that, we've gone through all the way up to the point of where we've gotten through the Ottoman Empire, and I think we ended last week at the end of the Ottoman Empire when they lost the war. They lost along with Germany and Austria-Hungary. They lost in 1918, November the 11th at 11 o'clock, when the armistice went into effect and ended the World War I. And because of that, the Ottoman Empire lost their hold on a lot of land, and so they had to determine what to do with the land. And that's going to be part of what we're going to be talking about tonight in the British Mandate, when they, I think Diana was hinting that I move over a little bit. She was leaning like this. This is the mandated land of Great Britain, the mandate for Palestine. Notice all of that's called Palestine at that particular time. Well, we know that they divided it here, and this became Transjordan, then became Jordan on this side of it, so it was divided into two different parts. And they were trying to, can you imagine how much fun it was for the British to try to oversee this land with people who've been fighting back and forth for centuries, and you have to decide what to do with the land. Many people have criticized Britain and the United Nations for how they handled it, but I don't know of any good way to handle it unless you just let them continue to beat each other up, and who wins gets whatever they earn back. But if you lose a war and a country takes territory because you lost a war, that's called too bad, so sad. That's just the way it is. The spoils of war goes to the victor, does not go to the loser. And I wanted to show you these two maps. We're going to get to more in depth on these as we go throughout this with the British Mandate. This one, I just wanted to put things into perspective. That red area of Israel, which you see covers all of that, when you're thinking about the Palestinian, what they say, won't make this into a Palestinian state and Gaza together into a Palestinian state. And you say, well, all this land here was Israel. This is the Negev desert. This is desert. There's not, I think it's 8. I've seen 8%, I've seen 13%, 12%. So 13%, no more than 13% of the population of Israel lives in this area anywhere, because most of it's not habitable. Part of it they've turned into productive farmland and so on, but for the most part, there's not many people that live there. So when you talk about dividing the land and dividing it between the Arab territory, it wasn't divided for the Palestinians. It was the Arab territory and the Jewish territory is what they divided it into. And this is what we'll get to in just a few minutes. And this is the proposed way that they divided up the land between. The blue is what you see was Jewish, and this is Arab. So it's considered a Jewish state and an Arab state, and you see the Arab states divided in between different sections, different segments. Now I want to read something here. Foreign Office, November 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. and will use these best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So this is the Balfour Declaration. He said, I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours truly, author James Balfour. And this was the Balfour proposal, declaration, that they incorporated in this as a way to get the Jews a homeland, a place for them to create a nation where they could be safe and where they could self-government and so on. But they have the British people were recognizing their right to have a home there. The Balfour Declaration was endorsed in principle by the Allied powers in July the 24th at the League of Nations, 1922. The Jewish National Fund was started, and it was to raise money. I forgot how much all they got to buy land in the area of Palestine. And you have to remember that portions of that land were purchased by this fund, and other people had purchased the land from them because the people that sold it to them didn't think the land was worth anything anyway, and then they turned it into something productive. Then it became valuable all of a sudden. So that's when they were founded, back in 1901, and they kept raising money and so on and purchasing land in order to get a homeland for the Jewish people. Great Britain administered Palestine on behalf of the League of Nations from 1920 to 1948, and referred to as the British Mandate. The preamble to the mandate says this: whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November the 2nd, 1917, by the government of His Britannic Majesty, and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other nation. So you see, they took the Balfour Declaration and they combined it in with this in the preamble to state this is the stated purpose, that this is what we want the mandatory, the nation that's overseeing this, which was Great Britain. You come up with a plan for them, you oversee it, you make sure everything's taken care of, and so on. And then they would decide what to do at a later date. But this was the mandate. And the League of Nations, the reason for the mandatory or the mandate was what you see underlined there, and it says, until such time as they are able to stand alone. In other words, these nations had been, this area, all of this area, not just the area we're talking about here, but the British Mandate is what became where we have Israel today, what they call Gaza, the occupied territory, and Jordan. All of that together was under British authority. The French had different areas and so on, but they were overseeing that particular area. Under Ottoman rule, Palestine had been divided into administrative districts referred to as Sanjak. We're getting back to the name Palestine. Under the Ottoman Empire, this area was referred to as Palestine. It was not a nation. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was divided up in these three divisions that you see here. A Sanjak of Acre, the Sanjak of Nablus, and the Sanjak of Jerusalem. In fact, you'll see, I don't know if you can see in this one or not, but around Jerusalem, I have another one later on that you'll be able to see. Jerusalem was declared an international area where it didn't belong to the Arabs nor the Jews. Once they divided it up and came up with a division for it, it was kept separate from the rest of it. I worked with a guy that he liked history about as much as I did, and he was always of the opinion that Jerusalem should be made an international city and not belonging to the Jews nor to the Arab because of the problem, but that would never work because both claim it as their capital. During the time, the different empires that ruled the Promised Land after Abraham, after the Jews were there, was the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Grecian, Roman, Ottoman. It changed hands many times. We've talked about that throughout this particular course, that it changed hands a lot of times. And that's even after that, during the leading up to the Ottoman Empire, when after the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, when they came into power there, before they came into power, there was, I went through a whole list of things, and it was only a minor portion of what occurred, and how many times this land was taken from this group, and this group took this land from this group, and it was not a group, it's not a nation that stayed the same for generation after generation after generation. It changed hands many times. Even after the Arabs conquered the Promised Land, there was different groups of Arab would take it away from different other groups of Arabs. So it was it never was a homogeneous group of people as one nation. And with the fall of the Ottoman Empire came the British Mandate. And I wrote this at the bottom. The Mandate did not make Palestine part of the British Empire. What it did was it put it under their authority until a set time, and then they would come out from under the Mandate. So Israel had from the 1920s to 1948 to get things sorted out. It gave them a few years. And this is a statement I had earlier. This British Mandate, they were here. They administered this area of Palestine from 1920 to 1948. And they did it because of what I said before, until such time as they are able to stand alone. In other words, it's kind of the situation that we were in when in World War I, and the Spanish, one of their colonies was the Philippines. And because we were at war with Spain to keep some pressure off of the Spanish coming over to Cuba and sending more troops, sending more ships and so on, had Admiral Dewey, who was in Hong Kong, to go to Manila in the Philippines, in different areas of the Philippines, and to take the Philippines from the Spanish, is what they went in there for. Then after World War I, then here you are where they have a group of people that want the Filipinos that want to be free and independent, but they really weren't in a position to do so. Germany wanted the Philippines, and Russia wanted the Philippines, and everybody wanted the Philippines except for the people that wound up with the Philippines, and that was us. And it created some problems because of it, but they weren't in a position to stand on their own. McKinley arrived at the conclusion that either we protect them and work with them until they can get to the point where they can be independent, or some other nation is going to come in and conquer them, and that's most likely what would have happened. And this is the same thing we're talking about here. If Great Britain and France and so on had not have taken control of these areas, it would have been worse than what it is today. They've received much criticism over the years, and people say they shouldn't have done this. They went arbitrarily in and divided. That's what happens when you lose a war. When you lose a war, other people get to make decisions about your land, especially when it's a war that the winner did not start. Through the years following the fall of the Promised Land, the population of the area changed many times. British Mandate, nations' homelands would be formed and make up the Middle East as we know it today. The area had become sparsely populated. We talked about that last time, that the population had begun to decline more and more and more because of different reasons. It was not very good land, for one thing, because if this field back here behind us, you just leave it alone, don't plant anything, don't plow it, don't do anything, what's going to happen? It's going to grow up. There's trees going to grow a little. You give it a few years, it's going to be woods. it'll be it'll be a mess. So nobody was taking care of the land, and had been different people were conquering. There's many wars that happened in this area, so the land was not something that a lot of people wanted, but a few people did. But at the bottom of the last line there was no nation of Israel and no nation of Palestine at this time. Neither one existed. The area of Palestine was called Palestine because it was the area. Like America is an area, and it's made up of different countries. Same thing happened with Palestine. It was not a country. It was, in fact, you go all the way back. Well, we won't do that. I've got too much to cover. Jewish people historically defined themselves as the Jewish diaspora, which means they were scattered out everywhere. A group of the people living in exile. Their traditional homeland was Palestine, a geographic region on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Jewish leaders traced the source of the Jewish diaspora to the Roman occupation of Palestine, because that's when they started scattering different places. It was under the Roman Empire, then called Judea. And they were fleeing the occupation, and many of the Jews migrated to Europe at this particular time. Beginning in the 1200s, Jewish people were expelled from England, France, and Central Europe. Where do you go? You're expelled. They had gone there because they basically had to leave the area that they lived in and what was their homeland. They had to leave that, and they were part of the diaspora. They were exiled from their home, and then you go into Europe, and they went into many of the European nations, and then in the 1200s they were expelled from England, France, and Central Europe. Most resettled in Russia and Eastern Europe, mainly Poland. A small population, however, immigrated to Palestine. In 1492, what happened in 1492? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, when that was coming, I made this statement before. One of the reasons Columbus was having trouble finding ships for his expedition is because the Jews were buying up ships because they had to get out of Spain or they'd be in trouble. So King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who were Catholic, they were Christians, and they wanted to do, quote, God's will, and they felt like it was God. That's the reason they were the ones that financed Christopher Columbus's voyage, is to come over to the New World here, or actually he was thinking about the West Indies, and to bring the Christian faith with them. And in other words, they were doing God's will. They also felt like, from what I've read about what they said during the time, they felt like they were doing God's will by running the Jewish people out of Spain. So it proves that sometimes when you can think you're doing God's will when you're not necessarily doing that. Well, after that, some of the refugees settled in Palestine. So you see, all this time you have some Jews coming back to Palestine. There was some there already. There were Arab people there. There were different groups of people there. And all over these different times, they were beginning to come back to this land, which was the land of their fathers. At the turn of the 20th century, European Jews were migrating to Palestine in large numbers, fleeing religious persecution. So you can see that the Jews for years they were running from persecution. In 1881, Russians began mass killings of Jews. Would you leave? If they didn't kill you, you would. These mass killings, called pogroms, compelled many Jews to flee Russia and to settle in Palestine. So a little bit you're seeing more and more and more Jews beginning to settle in Palestine. They were not the only people there, and it was not a nation at that time. It was not the nation of Israel or the nation of Palestine. By the mid-1900s, anti-Semitism had developed into a powerful political force in Europe. You know, and I said this since all this happened back on October the 7th, and I didn't realize how much anti-Semitism was still alive in our nation, in our state, as what came to light once this happened. The hatred of the Jews was something, it amazed me.
That's something I was going to ask you tonight. I was just reading last night, I think, about the way that universities, how the universities in North Carolina
Oh, yeah.
pretty much are to this.
It's
Exempt everybody else.
we could spend a long time talking about what caused that, but for right now, it was just part of what happened. In the early 1930s, more than 100,000 Jewish refugees came to Palestine from Nazi Germany and Poland. Zionism gained popularity. So they were coming back again. What was happening here, you could see that as it gets into the 30s and the 40s, how many Jews did Hitler have exterminated? They used the number like 6 million of the Jews. Yeah, they had exterminated like 6 million, which is a big percentage of all the Jews that lived. Sometime I hadn't looked it up recently. Look up, just put in your search engine on the computer and say, how many Jews are in the world right now? You'll be shocked at how small a number that is. Anyway, with them coming in, with the Zionism gained popularity. What's Zionism? I put down the definition so we know. Zionism, you don't have to look it up, you can just look at the screen. A movement for originally for this reason, the establishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodor Herzl and was later led by, way we'd say it, back swamp way is Chaim, there's more Chaim Weissman. You notice that's a German name? Many of the Jews were in German nations and nations that were attached to them, and a lot of the Jews were German Jews that came to the Promised Land at that time. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire dissolved and Palestine became part of the United Kingdom, not as a possession, but as a protectorate, if you will. And they started allowing more Jews to migrate to Palestine, to the Promised Land. They set a limit on how many they could. Well, the Jews, if you were in Germany or Poland or Czechoslovakia or anywhere like that, you would have to get out of town or hide. And they had to go somewhere, so whatever limits was set by the powers that be at this particular time, more Jews than that came into the Promised Land because they had nowhere else to go. I thought you might find this an interesting picture. Can you tell what this is from where you are? Well, he's not, you call him that. He's the Grand Mufti, I think is what they called him back then. I think I got that on the next screen. Anyway, he's sitting there talking with him. He created a coalition for World War II. The Arabs sided with, the Ottoman Empire, sided with the Germans in World War I, and they lost their land because of it. Now, World War II, here we have the Arabs, the Muslims siding with the Nazis. So things didn't work well for them. The Arabs were Germany's natural friends. Haj Amin al-Husseini told the Nazi leader in 1941 because they had the same enemies, namely the English, the Jews, and the communists. So the Nazis, this is your enemies, and this is our enemies. So they became allies with Germany, just as the Ottoman Empire had become allies with the Germans up to that time. Now, we'll get to the point where they start dividing up the land. The UN drew up these, and you can see this little pink area, that's around Jerusalem, and that's it tells you down here, it's the international zone is what they set that up to be. And this area is for Arab territory, and the blue is this is for an Arab state, and this land was for a Jewish state. And again, this part of it is desert. So you can see there's not much there. So this is the way we're going to divide it up. We're going to see to it that the Arabs have land. We're going to see to it that the Jews have land. So they arbitrarily set up borders. Guess who didn't accept that? The Arabs didn't accept it. The Jews said, okay. May 14th, 1948, Britain withdrew with the expiration of the mandate, and the state of Israel was proclaimed by Jewish Agency Chairman David Ben Gurion. The next day, forces from Egypt, Transjordan, which is now Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq attacked Israel. Now let's go back. All of those nations that you see here, all of those nations attacked this little country. All of them did. But look at these two maps. This is the map we'll be just looking at. This is the Jewish state. This is the Arab state. And all these countries attacked this little nation, but the little nation beat them all. And when they did, they took over this much land. So you people say, how did they wind up with all this land? Originally, the mandate was only this much. It's because all these Arab nations around here, this was an Arab state, said, we're allowing you an Arab state, and all these nations jumped on Israel, determining to exterminate them, destroy them. Israel did not attack any of them, did not go to destroy any of them. They came in to destroy Israel. So what happens when you lose the war? To the victor goes the spoils. And that's what happened. So it increased this. At this time, Jordan annexed what they call the West Bank now. People say that's where they want to have a Palestinian homeland. It's debatable whether that's what they want or not. But anyway, it became part of Jordan. So it still was not Palestine. It became part of Jordan. And it stayed that way for several years. 1967 war, instigated by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Here we are again, not even 20 years later, and they come in, they're going to wipe out this little country of Israel. And how long did the war last? What's the nickname of the war? It lasted a week. Lasted a week, and Israel won, and they took the West Bank, they took the Golan Heights, they took Gaza, and they took the Sinai Peninsula. With some of this was from each one of the countries that had attacked them. You can see that in each one of these, it creates a buffer between Israel and their enemies, something that they needed at this particular time. So they took this land over. It didn't stay that way for many years. 1967, after the 6 Days War, this is what it looked like. This dark blue area, the Sinai Peninsula, and all this was part of Israel. 1993, with the agreements that they had made with, you remember this, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin signed a peace treaty, and Israel gave them back the Sinai Peninsula. But Gaza was still under occupied territory under Israel at this particular time. It had belonged to Egypt. And this is what you see here. This says controlled areas in 2011, and this is where the Arabs are, and the area here is what was turned over to them, and this is what we call the occupied territory. The Golan Heights is still in the possession of Israel. Israel will never give up the Golan Heights, that as far as I can see, because they need that buffer in order to protect them from their enemies. So you see this, the land is changing even after it became the nation of Israel. Israel grew and Israel would shrink, and Israel would make concessions with different Arab leaders and turn out the gate. They didn't have to give the Sinai Peninsula back to the Arabs, but the Arabs under Anwar Sadat. And you remember Anwar Sadat was assassinated because of this. Because the extremists didn't want a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, but they had the treaty and they got this land back, and so it begins to change shape again. The Jerusalem Mufti Haj Amin Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian Arabs from the early 1920s to 1940s, said in his testimony to the British Peel Commission, this is what he said: most residents of Jewish lands will not be awarded citizenship in our future country. Let's see, who's talking about a two-state solution? We've been talking about a two-state solution for years. Over there, until you come up with a two-state solution, you're never going to have peace in the Middle East. He said, I don't care what happens, they're not going to get citizenship here. The Mufti suggested that Jews be deported from Palestine. So he says, that, I want you to just get them all out of our land, rejecting the idea of a Jewish state. Keep in mind now, Israel had won this. He promised that if such a state were established, every last Jew would be expelled from a Palestinian Arab state. He said, we're going to kick all the Jews out. That's what we're going to do. Now, this is the people. Now, you want to make a peace treaty with people like this? November 1947, the Mufti refused to adopt the UN partition plan that offered this to establish two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Mufti rejected a two-state solution until the day he died. In that commentary there, a choice ordinary Palestinians may well regret. And I'm quite sure they did. Isn't it something how politicians start wars and regular everyday people wind up suffering for the wars that politicians start? I'm quite sure some of you remember Yasser Arafat. The successor to the Mufti, Yasser Arafat, continued to reject any legitimacy for the state of Israel. He continued, when the PLO was formed, which he talks about this later, further down here, he and the PLO said Israel had no right to exist. They're not a nation. They shouldn't be here. Even after all this, now keep in mind this is getting up close to where we are today in time, and they're still saying they do not have a right to be here. We want them exterminated. We don't want them here. They don't have a right to exist. This is Arab land. This is Palestinian land. This is the nation of Palestine. This has nothing to do with Israel, although it had been established long before this that they were a country. So when Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with the Israelis in 1979, Arafat's PLO called for Egypt to be boycotted. The Arab states adopted that boycott and prevented Cairo from participating in the Arab League from 1977 until 1989. So what's the attitude of all the Arab nations around there? They didn't like the idea that he signed a peace treaty with them. You might guess they hated the Jews. Most Arab ambassadors in Egypt were recalled, and Arabs visiting Egypt were considered either traitors or spies. Pretty harsh. Now this. The Palestinians responded to Israel's attempts to implement the Oslo Accords in 1993. Bill Clinton, if you remember, he was in office, and he oversaw that. And what did they do? They started bombing buses, suicide bombings, sending in missiles. They clearly rejected the statement. They wouldn't accept the accords. Israel would agree to the accords. The Arabs would not. At the July 2000, at Camp David Summit, Israel PM Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Arafat a series of far-reaching concessions as part of a comprehensive peace arrangement. In return, Arafat was asked to end the conflict. The PLO summarily rejected the Israeli proposal and never offered a counter proposal. Okay, we're talking about a two-state solution. Israel had offered a two-state solution. The Arabs won't accept it. Israel offers a two-state solution. The Arabs won't accept it. August 2005, you know about this, Ariel Sharon decided to turn the Gaza, give Gaza its independence, and there were Jewish settlers in Gaza. He forcibly brought them out of Gaza, and the homes they had built, the properties they had owned, the places they had owned, land they had bought and owned there, he made them just leave their homes and come into the nation of Israel and turn it back over to Gaza, and that worked out well for Israel. What they do, they started launching what they did. I'm not a prophet, but when they're doing, I said, just as soon as they get out of there, they're going to be firing rockets out of Gaza at Israel. And what did they do? So I want to show you a chart. And this only goes to 2014. Rocket attacks on Israel from the Gaza Strip. 2001, 510, 2002, 661, 2003, 848, 2004, 1,528, 2005, 488, 2006, 1,123, 2007, 2,427, 2008, 3,278. You look all the way across, and this is how many missiles have been fired from Gaza into Israel from 2001 until 2014. That doesn't count what's happened in the 9 years since then, almost 10 years now. Since then, they fired all the... What would it be like to live in a country where you had this many missiles being shot over there? One thing that has helped them is the Patriot missile system that the Iron Dome that we have sent. It takes out a lot of these rockets, but some of them land as well. Part of it, the reason they're not more successful is because they've been inept to a large degree. But, pardon me? No. Yeah, and left them materials and so on. But anyway, still looking for a solution. But this is what happens when Israel decides we want to come up with a plan to make the Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs happy. And what they get for their trouble is rockets and attacks, You remember the suicide bombers? There was somebody at the time when that first was really going strong. He said you shouldn't call them suicide bombers. You should call them homicide bombers, because they're in their purpose. They're going to kill themselves, but they're in there to kill more Jews than they kill themselves. They go on buses and blow themselves up and blow up men, women, children, destroy them. And that's what was happening in Israel by these people who want a two-state solution. And they offer them the two-state solution, and they won't take the two-state solution. What do the Arab nations think today about the Palestinian Arabs? The Arab nations. What do the Arab nations think? Not Israel, not the United States. Okay? Here we go. Former Ambassador Ryan Crocker. The so-called Arab Street, a term for public opinion in the Arab world, was behind the Palestinian cause, but it never really affected policy on the part of any of the Arab governments. As you go through the region, almost all the Arab governments were united on one point, which was that the Palestinians were a threat, a foreign population that should be weakened, if not eliminated. This is the Arab nations. Did you hear that on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN? You didn't hear any of that. This is what this, in an interview, ambassador said. Let's go a little further. Some members of Israel's conservative government are now openly advancing the idea of expelling the Palestinian population from Gaza. I guess so. Most of Israel is not doing this, but some of them are saying, now look, the only way we're going to get any peace is to get rid of all these people in here. That's not going to happen. But here's Ambassador Crocker again. If that were to happen, they would have nowhere in the Arab world to go. Have you noticed that how many of the Egypt is on the border with Gaza? How many refugees from Gaza have they accepted since the war started? You can count it real quick. None.
I know they let 1,500 come in for medical reasons.
For medical reasons. But I mean, as far as allowing refugees, no. They're in there for years. But they won't allow them to stay. Now, get this quote. Despite public support for Palestinian rights, in truth, nearly every Arab state has long viewed the Palestinians with fear and loathing. This is especially true of Egypt, which will continue to refuse to admit Palestinians from across the border, he says. Now, what's the war going on over there for? And what are they saying? They're saying we want a Palestinian state. All we want is our own state. Then they chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. We just want our nation. Continue that. What's noteworthy in this entire conflict since October the 7th has been the lack of reaction or response from the Arab world. Saudi Arabia continues to hold the door open for a peace agreement with Israel. They stopped because of the attacks, but they were entering in a peace agreement. The UAE, Morocco, Bahrain didn't even withdraw ambassadors at that time. Jordan did, but of course, with about half of its population being Palestinian, Jordan has a particular problem. That lack of reaction, I think, is very telling. If you needed another example that Arab states are not viscerally concerned about the Palestinians and their fate, this would be it. How many homeless Gazans would you have right now if all the Arab nations around them had accepted the refugees? They have plenty of room for all of them. I mean, you have all these Arab lands. Israel, now this is in the Hamas charter, which we're winding down here. This is part of Hamas's charter. I got this from their charter. This is not what somebody said about it. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. This is Hamas, these people that you're saying we need a ceasefire with Hamas. Israel is of the mind this time we need to destroy Hamas before we can have any peace. Can you see why? On June the 23rd, 2019, on a broadcast on Hamas's Al-Aqsa TV, Hamas MP Marwan Abu Ras explained about Jews that everything people say about massacres and Holocaust, these are all lies. Hitler may have hated them, but it was because of their deeds and crimes. It's all lies. I'm listening to the interviews of some of the kids on these college campuses who are protesting in favor of the Palestinians, and you ask them what it's about, and they don't know. If you ask, I bet you they couldn't even tell you on a map where the area is. And I've heard them saying, the same people, same groups, said Hitler didn't kill all these people. That's a lie. There weren't any massacres that the Hamas did, perpetrated on October the 7th. They didn't go in and kill people. They didn't behead babies. They didn't stick babies in ovens. They didn't rape women. They didn't murder people. They didn't do any of this. It's all a lie made up by the Jews. It's what our college students are saying on our college campuses. May the 7th, 2021, on a broadcast on Hamas's Al-Aqsa TV, a senior Hamas figure said this: cut off the heads of the Jews. Cut off the heads of the Jews. That sounds like they want peace to me. Historically, who has the greater claim to the land that we call Israel today? Because that's where we started with this. They were arguing about who has the greater claim to this land historically, and who is it? It's, as far as we're concerned, as far as the Christian world is concerned, it's the Israelis, because it's part of the covenant with Abraham thousands of years ago. The people did not do what they were supposed to, so they wound up losing their land. They wound up losing their autonomy. A lot of things went wrong, but there was never any place in there at all. Forget a religious perspective or anything else. From a historical perspective, the Jews have populated that land for a lot more years than anybody else. The Muslims could not have inhabited that land before the 600s because it didn't even exist as religion. And Israel, thousands of years before, did. So the British Mandate of Palestine. That's the way it originally was, and then it was divided. And that's where we end tonight. Any questions or comments?